Thomas Whitmore had never thought much about the fine print. The year was 1873, and land was cheap in Montana Territory, especially when the seller was desperate. So when the territorial clerk offered him 640 acres of fertile valley for half what others paid, he jumped at the chance. He dreamed of being his own man, building a home, starting a new life far from the noise of Pennsylvania's railroads. But as he stood in the doorway of his new cabin, staring up at a woman who blocked the sun itself, he realized there was something the clerk forgot to mention. She was enormous, 9 feet tall if she was an inch, her blonde hair falling in braids thicker than his arms, her blue eyes sharp as mountain ice. She wasn't just tall, she was built on another scale entirely, every line of her body made for work and war in a land that devoured weaker souls. And when she spoke, her voice carried command, not request. "Get naked, little man," she said. Thomas's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air. "I'm sorry, what I said," she repeated, stepping closer so the porch creaked under her boots. "Get naked. I need to see what I'm working with." Thomas backed into the doorway, clutching the frame as though it might save him. "Ma'am, I think there's been some mistake." "No mistake," she replied. "I'm Astrid Erickson. According to territorial law, I come with this land, whether you like it or not." Thomas blinked, certain he'd misheard. "You come with the land." Astrid gave a thunderous laugh that rolled like distant thunder. "Aye, little man." Magnus Olsson, the last owner, signed a contract binding his heirs and any who bought from him to provide for me in exchange for protection, labor, and companionship. Thomas felt his stomach twist. Companionship. She pulled a weathered parchment from her coat and held it out. Her fingers were long and scarred, yet delicate as they unrolled the document. "Read it for yourself." Section 12, subsection 4. All contractual obligations, including personal service agreements, transfer with the deed. Thomas squinted at the fine print, but the meaning was plain enough. Whoever owned this land inherited Astrid Erickson, all 9 feet of her. "This is insane," he muttered. "No one said anything about people coming with the property." Astrid shrugged, her smile fading into something cold. "Then you should have read the fine print before you paid your money. The law doesn't care what you didn't know." Thomas stared around the cabin, seeing it now with new eyes. The 10-foot door frames, the oversized furniture, the iron pots large enough to feed a dozen men. Everything was built for her. Even the bed in the corner looked like something from a giant's house in a fairy tale. "This place was built for you," he said quietly. "For us," Astrid corrected. Her tone softened slightly. "Magnus and I were partners. He understood what it takes to survive out here." "Do you?" Thomas swallowed. "I came here to build a life. Not this." Astrid's expression hardened again. "Then you'll lose it. If you break the contract, the land reverts to the territory, and you forfeit every dollar. You'll leave with nothing but the clothes on your back." He could see she meant it. This woman wasn't bluffing. The certainty in her voice was the kind born of many winters and harder truths. "And if I agree," he asked, "then you get the benefit of my strength, my skills, and my company." She leaned closer, her shadow swallowing him whole. "Magnus didn't survive 5 winters here because of luck. He survived because of me." Thomas's mind spun. She was offering him survival. Protection from the wild beasts, from the cold, from isolation that drove men mad. But at what cost? The companionship part? He began carefully. "What exactly does that mean?" Her lips curled into a smile that made his pulse race and his knees weaken. "It means what you think it means, little man." Magnus understood the value of keeping warm through long winters. Thomas stepped back, his face burning. "I can't just, this isn't." "Then walk away," Astrid said simply. "But the snow will come early, and this valley eats men who think they can face it alone." She turned her gaze toward the distant mountains. "Their bones are out there, if you'd like to join them." He looked out at the wilderness stretching endlessly in every direction. Dark forests, steep ridges, and the fading light that already hinted at how quickly civilization was weeks away. He couldn't survive alone, not with winter coming. "What happens if I agree?" he asked again. Astrid's expression softened. though her eyes still glinted like steel. "Then I'll protect you as I did Magnus. I'll build with you, fight beside you, and teach you how to stay alive out here. But once you agree, there's no turning back." The contract becomes binding in law, and in spirit, Thomas hesitated only a moment longer before stepping aside and gesturing toward the open doorway. "All right." "Inside?" Then Astrid nodded once. "Good. But understand this, little man. Once you invite me in, your life changes forever." As she ducked through the doorway, the cabin seemed to shrink around her. The air grew heavy with the scent of pine and smoke and something wild that clung to her skin. Thomas felt the weight of what he'd agreed to, a partnership that defied reason, law, and perhaps even nature itself. He watched her move about the cabin with ease, her head nearly brushing the rafters, and realized something strange. He was no longer afraid. Terrified, yes, but fascinated too. He had come to Montana for freedom and found himself bound to a woman who could crush him with her hands or keep him alive with her strength. And somewhere deep down, beneath the fear, he wondered which she would choose. Thomas barely slept that first night. The sound of the wind, howling through the pines, mingled with the heavy creak of the cabin as Astrid moved about, her presence filling every corner of the space. When morning came, he found her already outside, splitting wood as if each swing of her axe was cutting through the sky itself. "Morning, little man," she said without looking up. Her voice rolled like distant thunder. "You slept late." Thomas rubbed his neck. "Didn't think I'd be sharing a roof with a legend," Astrid chuckled. "Not a legend. Just a woman who learned to survive when the world decided not to make room for her." He watched her drive the axe into another log, sending it flying in 2 perfect halves. "You really expect me to pay $50 a month?" he asked. "That's the contract." She looked at him with calm certainty. Magnus did. "So will you," Thomas sighed. "I could barely afford the land." "Then you'd better learn fast how to make it pay for itself." The next few days were a blur of labor and lessons. Astrid taught him to track, to read the sky, to build a fire in wind and rain. She moved with purpose, graceful despite her size, strong yet patient. Thomas tried to keep up, and though he failed often, she never mocked him. Each correction came with quiet firmness. "Out here," she said one evening as they repaired a broken fence, "pride kills faster than wolves." Quote. As the sun set, painting the mountains in crimson light, Thomas found himself watching her with something new, not fear, not awe, but respect. That night, as they sat by the fire, Astrid spoke softly, her eyes reflecting the flames. "Magnus was a good man. He treated me fair. Died last spring." Heart gave out while he was cutting wood. Thomas felt a lump rise in his throat. "I'm sorry," she nodded. "He was the first man who ever looked at me without fear. The only one who saw a person instead of a monster." Thomas hesitated. "Is that what you think you are?" Her gaze snapped to his. "What else could I be? Look at me." He met her eyes, steady for the first time. "I see a woman who scares the hell out of me, and who's probably the only reason I'm still alive." For a moment, the fire crackled between them in silence. Then she smiled. Small, but real. "You learn fast, little man." Days passed. They built fences, hunted, and stored food for winter. The routine made them a team. But at night, the contract's unspoken clause hung between them like a storm waiting to break. On the 5th night, Astrid stood at the cabin doorway, the firelight behind her outlining every powerful line of her frame. "It's time," she said. Thomas froze. "Time for what?" "For me to know whether you can handle this arrangement." His pulse quickened. "You mean—" "I mean," she interrupted, "I need to know if you're capable of surviving what Magnus and I built here. All of it. Not just the work. The closeness." The nights Thomas's throat went dry. "I don't want to disappoint you." "You won't," she said, stepping closer. "You're not Magnus. You are smaller, quicker, thoughtful. That might be what I need now." He felt heat rise in his chest as she looked him over with assessing calm. "Take off your shirt," she said. "Let me see what I'm working with." Her tone wasn't cruel. It was businesslike, but somehow gentle too. Thomas obeyed, feeling the chill of the cabin air on his skin. Astrid studied him like a craftsman examining raw material. "Lean, not strong yet," she said softly. "But your eyes, they don't quit." "That's better than muscle," Thomas swallowed hard. "And what about you?" she smirked. "You'll learn soon enough." They stood in silence, the fire crackling between them, something dangerous and tender growing in the air. Then, just as Thomas began to speak, Astrid turned toward the window. Her entire body going still, quiet. She whispered. From outside came the faint sound of horses, 6 of them, voices carried on the wind. "Rough, male, laughing trouble," Thomas whispered outlaws. She said, her tone hard as steel. I recognized the name one of them just shouted. Bull Morrison. "Who's he?" "A man who takes what he wants and kills what he can't." Thomas's blood turned cold. Astrid moved with sudden purpose, handing him his rifle. "Stay close. Don't fire unless I tell you." They stepped onto the porch just as 6 riders entered the clearing. Their leader, broad-shouldered with a scar down his cheek, grinned up at Astrid. "Well, look what we found, boys. The giant woman of Montana herself. And she's got herself a little husband." His men laughed. Thomas felt fury rise, but Astrid's calm hand stopped him. "This is private land," she said coldly. "You're not welcome here." Morrison dismounted, eyes roaming over her like a predator sizing up prey. "Private land? Out here, lady, land belongs to whoever can hold it." Astrid's eyes narrowed. "Then you'd best hope you can," Morrison laughed, stepping closer. "You planning to stop me, sweetheart?" Thomas raised his rifle. "She won't have to." The laughter stopped. The air thickened with tension. Morrison's men began to spread out, hands drifting toward their holsters. Astrid's eyes flicked to Thomas. One silent message: "Be ready." In that frozen second before the storm broke, Thomas realized this was no longer about land or contracts. It was about survival, and about the bond forming between him and the woman fate had tied to him. As Morrison sneered and opened his mouth to speak, Astrid lifted her rifle with inhuman speed. The war for their mountain had begun. The first gunshot cracked through the morning like thunder. Morrison's men dove for cover, shouting curses that echoed off the trees. Astrid's rifle barked again, each shot echoing with deadly purpose. Thomas dropped to one knee beside the porch rail, firing at shapes moving between the pines. "Keep your head down, little man!" Astrid shouted. She moved like lightning despite her size, firing, reloading, firing again. Every movement was precise, deliberate. No hesitation, no fear. Thomas realized she'd done this before, many times. The air filled with smoke, the smell of gunpowder, and the screams of wounded men. Within moments, 3 of Morrison's gang were down. The others scattered, shouting for cover. Morrison himself crouched behind his horse, firing blindly toward the cabin. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. He'd never killed a man before, but when one of the outlaws charged toward the porch, screaming with rage, he didn't think, he fired. The man fell face first into the dirt. Astrid looked at him once, not with judgment, but with pride. "That's how you survive," she said. "You don't hesitate." But the fight wasn't over. Morrison roared from behind his horse. "You'll pay for that, witch!" He rose, gun in hand, and fired. The bullet whistled past Astrid's shoulder, splintering the wood beside Thomas's head. She didn't flinch. Her next shot found Morrison's thigh, dropping him to one knee. "Stay down," she warned, but Morrison wasn't the kind of man who listened. Snarling, he grabbed Thomas, dragging him upright and pressing a pistol to his head. "Drop it, lady, or I'll paint your cabin with his brains!" Astrid froze. For a heartbeat, her face went cold and unreadable. Thomas felt the gun tremble against his temple. "Don't," he whispered. "Don't give him what he wants." Astrid's eyes locked on Morrison's, calm as stone. You think I can't make that shot? Morrison laughed, half crazed with pain and fury. You'll kill him too, quote. Her reply came like a whisper of death. Number, I won't. The next instant, her rifle cracked. Morrison's body went limp, his pistol falling harmlessly into the dust. The bullet had passed through his eye clean as a needle. Thomas stumbled free, gasping. Astrid lowered her rifle and exhaled once. Told you, she said simply. The clearing went quiet except for the moan of wind through the trees. The outlaws who'd survived fled into the forest, their courage shattered. Thomas leaned against the porch rail, chest heaving. Good God, Astrid, you didn't even blink. Men like that don't deserve hesitation, she said, scanning the tree line out here. Mercy gets you killed. They buried the bodies that afternoon behind the ridge, far from the cabin. Astrid worked in silence, her movements efficient and practiced. Thomas helped where he could, though his hands shook from adrenaline. When it was done, the two of them stood over the fresh earth. The mountains were quiet again, the sun dipping low. Was it always like this? He asked softly. Astrid nodded. Magnus and I fought off men like Morrison every few years. This land draws both dreamers and devils. The dreamers build. The devils take. It's always been that way. Thomas looked up at her, the giant woman who'd saved his life, his land, and maybe his soul. You could have killed me with that shot. I could have, she agreed. But I didn't. I never miss. That night, they sat by the fire, no words for a long time, just the crackle of flames and the soft hum of wind outside. Then Thomas said quietly, I think I understand now why Magnus kept you close. It wasn't just survival, was it? Astrid's eyes flicked to him. You're learning. It was trust, he said, the kind you can't buy, the kind that makes you stronger than the wilderness. She smiled faintly, then looked away. And what do you want from this arrangement, little man? Truly, Thomas hesitated, then met her gaze, a partner. Not because I have to. Because I want to. For the first time since he met her, Astrid looked uncertain. You'd choose me? A woman who could crush you with one hand. I'd choose the woman who saved my life when she didn't have to, he said. The woman who taught me to survive when I thought I couldn't. The size doesn't matter. The heart does. For a long moment, Astrid said nothing. Then she reached out, her hand engulfing his, and whispered, Then you'll never face this world alone again. Months passed. Winter came hard, burying the cabin under snow. Together they endured the long cold, hunting, repairing, surviving. The isolation that once frightened Thomas now felt like peace. And when spring thawed the mountains, they stood on the ridge overlooking their land, side by side. A territorial marshal arrived weeks later, asking about the missing men. Astrid handled him with calm confidence, explaining that outlaws had come and met justice the way they often did in the wilds. The marshal studied them both for a long time, then simply nodded. The territory could use more folks like you two, he said before riding away. That night, as the sun sank behind the peaks, Thomas turned to Astrid. He called us, you two. Not master and servant. Not landowner and contract. Just partners. She smiled. That's what we are. Then let's make it official, he said, surprising himself with the words, Marry me. Astrid blinked. You'd marry me. I already have, in every way that matters. Might as well make the law catch up. Quote, a slow, radiant smile spread across her face, the kind that could melt the last snows off the mountains. All right, little man, let's make it official. The next month, they stood before a traveling preacher, exchanging vows beneath the same sky that had watched them fight, bleed, and build together. I do. Thomas said I do. Astrid echoed, her voice carrying across the valley. And as the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, a hawk circled overhead, crying into the wind, as if the wilderness itself was giving its blessing. From that day on, folks in Montana spoke of the giant woman and the little man who tamed a mountain together, not with guns or greed, but with loyalty and love that no storm could break. The man who came west seeking land had found something far rarer, a home, and a woman whose heart was as vast and wild as the country itself. If you must keep a friend, keep a good one, because the friend you keep today just might be the spouse you're stuck with tomorrow. Some folks learn that lesson the hard way. Others stumble into it blind, drunk on whiskey and heartbreak. But for Megan Sloan, daughter of one of the most powerful ranchers in Colorado, that truth would cost her everything she thought she wanted and give her everything she never knew she needed. It was 1883 in Cedar Ridge, Colorado, when a woman's reputation was worth more than gold and losing it could destroy you faster than a prairie fire. The Crystal Palace Saloon had never looked finer. Every piece of glass sparkled under the lamplight, and the polished mahogany bar gleamed like new. Megan Sloan stood in front of a tall mirror in the back room, adjusting the pearl buttons on her emerald green dress. At 22, she was the picture of elegance, golden hair pinned high, blue eyes clear as the mountain sky, and skin untouched by the sun. Tonight was supposed to be the start of her perfect future. "Hold still, dear," her mother, Tara Winslow Sloan, said as she clasped a diamond necklace around Megan's throat. "This necklace belonged to my grandmother. She wore it when she married into the Winslow plantation family back in Virginia. Tonight, it will bring you luck, too." Megan forced a small smile. "Mother, are you certain about Logan Pierce? I've only spoken with him 3 times. "Certainty," Tara replied, smoothing her daughter's skirt, "is a luxury for the poor. Rich folks make practical choices. Logan Pierce owns 40,000 acres. When you marry him, our family's land will join his. Together, we'll have the largest ranching empire west of the Mississippi." Megan glanced at herself in the mirror, but the reflection staring back looked more like a stranger than a bride-to-be. Through the walls came the faint sound of fiddle music, clinking glasses and laughter. The party had already begun. Her father, Charles Sloan, entered the room with his usual booming pride. "Megan, the whole territory's here tonight. Even Governor Pitkin sent his congratulations. This is the biggest step our family has ever taken." Megan swallowed the lump in her throat. She had been raised to marry well, to protect her family's fortune. But tonight, for the first time, she wasn't sure if that life was truly hers to want. "It's time," her mother said, taking her arm. "Logan's waiting at the altar." The main hall of the Crystal Palace had been transformed. White ribbons draped the chandeliers, and every table overflowed with wildflowers. Nearly 200 guests turned as Megan entered. Murmurs of admiration filled the air. She felt every pair of eyes on her, heavy with expectation. But something was wrong. The altar was empty. Only the Reverend stood there, glancing at his pocket watch every few minutes. Logan Pierce was nowhere to be seen. Her father frowned. "Where is he?" "Perhaps his train was delayed," her mother whispered, though her voice shook. Minutes ticked by. 10, 20, 30. The music stopped. The guests whispered behind gloved hands, their polite smiles fading into uneasy curiosity. Megan stood frozen, heat rising in her cheeks. Every moment that passed felt like a lifetime. Then the saloon doors burst open. Logan Pierce strode in, tall and confident as ever, his dark hair gleaming under the lamps. But he wasn't alone. A woman in a red dress clung to his arm, her laughter sharp as broken glass. Her hand, Megan noticed, wore a brand-new wedding ring. The crowd gasped. "Well, well," Logan drawled, his smile smug and cruel. "Looks like quite the party. Sorry we're late. Had some important business to attend to." Her father stepped forward, face red with fury. "Pierce, what's the meaning of this?" "You're supposed to be at the altar." Logan raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. I've reconsidered the arrangement." "What?" Tara whispered, her hand tightening painfully around Megan's arm. Logan's eyes swept the room before settling on Megan. "See? I need a woman with fire, Charles. Someone who can match my ambitions. Your daughter's pretty enough, I'll grant you, but she's soft as butter left in the sun. I need steel, not silk." The words hit like a bullet. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Megan's hands trembled, but she refused to cry. "Not here. Not in front of them all." "Meet my new wife," Logan continued, lifting the brunette's hand. "Brittany Vance. We were married this afternoon in Denver. She can ride, shoot, and negotiate a cattle deal better than most men. That's the kind of partner I need." Brittany smiled sweetly, her dark eyes glittering. "I do hope we can all be friends." Laughter, forced and uncomfortable, moved through the crowd. Megan stood frozen as her entire world crumbled around her. "You signed a contract!" her father roared. "You'll pay for this humiliation." Logan shrugged. "Contracts can be broken. Besides, what will you do, Charles? Sue me? I own half the judges between here and Kansas City." The crowd shifted uneasily. No one stepped forward. No one defended the Sloans. Money spoke louder than honor in Cedar Ridge. Charles reached for his gun, but Tara grabbed his arm. "Charles, don't. Not here." Logan tipped his hat mockingly. "No need for violence. I'm sure you'll find another buyer for your daughter's charms, though you might want to lower your price. She's damaged goods now." A murmur of shock ran through the guests. Megan's face burned, but she didn't move. She couldn't. "Get out," her father growled. "Before I forget, I'm a gentleman." Logan grinned, turning to leave. "No hard feelings, sweetheart. This is just business." The doors swung closed behind him, leaving silence and ruin in his wake. Megan's world fell apart. The whispers began immediately. Cruel, pitying, venomous. "Poor girl, ruined. Who'll marry her now?" Her father turned to her, voice cold as steel. "This is your fault." "Father, you must have done something to drive him away. I spent everything on this marriage, and you couldn't even hold a man's attention." Tears filled her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Her parents turned on each other, blaming, shouting. Guests slipped away, pretending not to hear. Within minutes, the celebration had turned into a wake. Megan stood alone among the half-eaten food and abandoned champagne glasses, her silk gown heavy as a burden. Without a word, she walked out of the Crystal Palace into the cold night air. The town of Cedar Ridge stretched before her, dark, silent, uncaring. The life she had been promised was gone, and before the night was over, she was about to make a choice that would change everything. The streets of Cedar Ridge were quiet that night. A cold wind carried the smell of dust and smoke, whispering through the wooden signs that creaked above shuttered storefronts. Megan Sloan walked with no clear direction, her emerald silk dress dragging against the rough planks of the boardwalk. A few men stumbled out of saloons, laughing loud and drunk, but most of the town slept, unaware that the daughter of Charles Sloan had just lost everything. Her heels clicked against the wood, sharp and lonely. She passed the post office, the blacksmith shop, and the general store where everyone in town used to greet her with polite smiles. Tonight, even the dogs didn't stir as she walked by. A torn, white ribbon from her ruined engagement party clung to her skirt. She yanked it free, watching it flutter away into the night. It reminded her too much of what she'd just lost: her pride, her name, her future. Then, ahead, she saw the dim light of a saloon still open, the Silver Dollar. Unlike the Crystal Palace, it wasn't a place for fine company. The Silver Dollar was for cowboys, drifters, and men who lived hard lives. But right now, Megan didn't care. Respectable society had already turned its back on her. She pushed through the bat-wing doors, and the smell of whiskey, tobacco, and sweat hit her like a wave. Heads turned. Conversations slowed. Her silk dress gleamed under the flickering lamps, and for a moment the place went still. She didn't belong here, and everyone knew it. Behind the bar stood a heavy-set man with gray in his beard. He raised an eyebrow. "We don't usually see your kind here, miss. You lost?" "No," she said, her voice steady though her heart was pounding. "I'd like a whiskey." The bartender gave her a long look. "You sure about that? We got sarsaparilla." "Whiskey," she repeated, "the strongest you have." He shrugged and poured the drink. 2 bits. She opened her small silk purse, the last remnant of her old life, and found the coins. The whiskey burned like fire as it went down, but she didn't flinch. The pain felt clean. Honest. The only thing tonight that did. "Another," she said. From the corner of the room, a man's voice drawled lazily, "Careful there, princess. That ain't lemonade." Megan turned toward him. A cowboy sat at a back table, chair tilted on two legs, hat low over his eyes. Even in the dim light, she saw something different about him. His clothes were plain but well kept, his boots dusty but not worn out. There was strength in the way he sat, easy, confident, but alert. And when he smiled, it wasn't mocking. It was kind. "I'm well aware," Megan said coolly, finishing her second drink. He chuckled, stood, and walked over. "Dylan Harrington," he said, tipping his hat. "And you're Megan Sloan, if I'm not mistaken." She froze. "You're not mistaken." "Thought so." Hard to miss the talk around town. Logan Pierce sure made himself the most hated man in Colorado tonight. The words cut, but there was no cruelty in his tone. Just quiet understanding. He gestured toward his table. "Mind if I buy you another drink? Looks like you could use one." Megan hesitated. A lady didn't sit in a saloon with a strange man, but she wasn't a lady anymore, was she? "Why not?" she said. Dylan motioned to the bartender for 2 glasses and waited until she sat before taking his seat. "So," he said, "rough night?" "You could say that," she replied bitterly. "The man I was supposed to marry walked into my engagement party with another woman, his new wife." Dylan's eyes darkened. "I heard he called you soft, didn't he?" Megan gave a bitter laugh. "Soft as butter left in the sun. Damaged goods, too." Dylan's jaw tightened. "Then he's a fool. Any man with sense could see there's fire in you. Maybe buried deep, but it's there." She blinked, surprised by the warmth in his voice. "You don't know me." "Maybe not," he said, taking a slow sip of whiskey. "But I know what I see. A woman who got humiliated in front of the whole town and still walked out with her head high. A woman sitting in a rough saloon, drinking whiskey like she's got something to prove. That's not soft, ma'am. That's strength." The words hit her harder than she expected. For the first time all night she felt seen. She looked down at her glass. "My family's ruined. My father's broke. He was counting on my marriage to Pierce to save us. Without it, we'll lose everything." Dylan leaned back in his chair. "So what will you do now?" "I don't know," she whispered. "No man will have me, not after this. My name's worth less than dust." He was quiet for a long moment, then said softly, "That's not true." Her laugh came out harsh. "You don't know this town." "I don't need to," he said. "I know people. And I know you've got more worth than that." Something in his voice made her chest ache. No man had ever spoken to her like that. Not her father, not Logan Pierce, not anyone. For the first time, she wanted to believe it. "What about you, Mr. Harrington?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "What brings a man like you to a place like this?" Quote, "Same thing that brings everyone else," he said with a small grin. "Bad luck and good whiskey." She couldn't help but smile a little. The tension eased between them. As the night wore on, they talked about the weather, the land, books, even dreams. Dylan spoke with an honesty she wasn't used to. He didn't treat her like a trophy or a burden. Just a person. When the bartender called last drinks, Megan realized how late it had gotten. The silver dollar was nearly empty. "I should go," she said softly. "Go where?" Dylan asked. "You said your parents blamed you for tonight. You think they'll welcome you back?" Her throat tightened. "No," she whispered. "I don't think they will." He reached across the table and took her hand. His touch was warm and steady. "Then come with me." She blinked. "What?" "Come with me," he repeated. "Marry me tonight." Megan stared, certain she'd misheard. "You can't be serious." "I am." "You need a husband, ma'am," he said with a half-smile, his dark eyes steady on hers. "And I reckon I could oblige." The room seemed to spin, not from whiskey this time, but from the wildness of it all. Marry a stranger? A cowboy she'd known for only a few hours? "That's insane," she said weakly. "Maybe," Dylan replied, "but sometimes the craziest choices are the only ones that make sense." He squeezed her hand gently. "What do you say, Megan Sloan? You ready to start a new life?" Her heart pounded in her chest. Everything she'd ever known was gone. Her family's wealth, her reputation, her future. But maybe, Just maybe. She had found something better. She met his gaze and whispered, "Yes." And with that single word, Megan Sloan's life took a turn she could never have imagined. The dawn crept slowly across the Colorado plains, soft light spilling over the hills and valleys. Megan stirred, her head heavy from the whiskey and the whirlwind of the night before. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then she heard the creak of wagon wheels and the steady rhythm of horses' hooves. "Morning, sunshine," Dylan called from the driver's seat, his voice warm with humor. "How's your head?" "Like it's been kicked by a mule," Megan muttered, sitting up. She was lying in the back of a wagon, wrapped in a rough wool blanket that smelled faintly of hay and leather. Her emerald dress was wrinkled, her hair tangled, and yet somehow she didn't care. "Where are we going?" "Home," Dylan said simply. "My ranch is about 15 miles south of town." Home. The word made her heart twist. She'd left everything behind, her parents, her family name, the life she was supposed to have. And now, she was married to a man she barely knew. Married in a dusty saloon by a half-drunk preacher, witnessed by a bartender and 2 strangers. It sounded ridiculous, but when she looked at Dylan's broad back and steady hands guiding the reins, she felt something that surprised her. Hope. The sun rose higher as the wagon rumbled along the trail. When they finally reached the small valley where Dylan's home stood, Megan's breath caught. A modest log cabin sat among golden fields, smoke curling gently from its chimney. A barn stood nearby, along with a chicken coop and a small garden patch. It wasn't grand, but it was peaceful, solid, built by hard work and honest hands. "It's not much," Dylan said, helping her down from the wagon, "but it's mine, free and clear, no debts, no strings." Megan looked around. It was a far cry from her father's mansion, with its polished floors and servants, but something about it felt alive. "It's different," she said carefully. Dylan grinned. "Different's not always bad." Inside, the cabin was simple but tidy. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, casting warmth across the room. The furniture was hand-carved and well-used, and the air smelled faintly of pine and fresh bread. Megan stood in silence, taking it all in. "I'll sleep in the barn tonight," Dylan said quietly. "Give you some space to think things through." "You don't have to do that," she replied. "Maybe not. But we both jumped fast into this. I reckon it's fair we take a breath before figuring out what comes next." He tipped his hat slightly and stepped outside, leaving her alone in the little cabin that was now her home. The first weeks were hard. Megan, who had never boiled water or mended a torn shirt in her life, found herself faced with chores from dawn to dusk. She burned every meal, dropped eggs, spilled milk, and nearly set the cabin on fire trying to light the stove. Dylan never scolded her. He just laughed, helped her try again, and taught her patiently. One morning, while she sat in the mud after losing yet another fight with their cow, Dylan walked over, biting back a grin. "Having a difference of opinion with Bessie, are you?" "She hates me," Megan said miserably. "Nah," Dylan said, crouching beside her. "She just doesn't trust you yet. You gotta be gentle, but firm, like this." He showed her how to milk the cow, his hands steady and sure. When Megan tried again, Bessie stood still. The pail filled with fresh milk. Megan smiled in triumph, and Dylan chuckled. "See? Told you she just needed to know who's boss." For the first time, Megan felt a flicker of pride in herself. She was learning. She was surviving. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Megan began to feel at home. She discovered strength she never knew she had, and every time she laughed, she saw how Dylan's eyes softened just a little more. He worked hard, treated her with respect, and listened when she spoke, and slowly, without even realizing it, she began to fall in love with him. One night, a storm rolled in from the mountains. The wind howled around the cabin, rattling the shutters. The oil lamp flickered, then went out, leaving only the glow from the fireplace. Dylan tossed another log onto the fire. "Worst storm I've seen in years," he said. "Good thing the roof's holding." Megan shivered, and without a word, Dylan pulled a quilt over her shoulders. They sat close together, watching the flames dance. In that soft light, his rough features looked almost gentle. "Tell me something," Dylan said after a while. "What did you dream of before all this? Before Pierce, before the scandal?" Megan hesitated. "I wanted to be a teacher," she said quietly, "but my parents said it wasn't proper. A lady's job was to marry well, not work for wages." "Seems to me," Dylan said, "you'd have made a fine teacher. You've got patience, and a stubborn streak that could tame wild horses." She smiled at him, warmed by his words. "What about you?" He looked into the fire. "I just wanted to build something real, not fancy, just mine." Silence fell again, soft and comfortable. Then Dylan turned to her, his eyes earnest. "Megan, I need to tell you something. I didn't just marry you to save you from scandal. Somewhere between that night in the saloon and right now, I fell in love with you." Her breath caught. For a moment, she couldn't speak. "I don't expect you to say it back," he continued, "but I needed you to know." Megan looked at him, at the man who had taken her in when she had nothing, who had never once treated her like a burden or a bargain. She reached up, cupped his face in her hands, and kissed him. It was soft, but sure. When they finally pulled apart, she whispered, "You don't have to wait for me to say it back, Dylan. You already know." Years passed, and their small cabin became a thriving ranch. Megan worked beside Dylan every day, their hands and hearts building something far stronger than money could buy. She learned that love didn't come from wealth or titles. It came from laughter shared over burnt biscuits, from weathering storms together, from trust built day by day. And one sunny morning, 5 years later, when Logan Pierce rode up to their gate, broken, bitter, and penniless, Megan faced him with her chin high and eyes clear. Gone was the girl he had humiliated. Before him stood a woman who had found her worth. He tried to speak, but Dylan's hand rested easily on his holster, and Logan's courage faded quick. Megan smiled politely. "You were right, Mr. Pierce. I was soft once. But life with the right man will forge steel out of anything." When Logan rode away, defeated, Dylan turned to her. "Feel better?" "Much," she said, slipping her arm around him. "And, Mr. Harrington, you did promise to oblige when I needed a husband." He grinned, pulling her close. "And I aim to keep that promise, Mrs. Harrington. Always." As the wind rolled through the valley and their children's laughter echoed from the fields, Megan smiled. Life had started with whiskey and heartbreak, but it had led her home. To love, to freedom, to the life she was meant to live. The wagon wheels snapped like a rifle shot through the canyon, echoing off the red cliffs as dust rose thick into the dying sun. The preacher's carriage toppled sideways, spilling trunks, books, and belongings across the rough desert trail. One terrified scream split the stillness, then silence followed. Heavy, waiting, endless. Ezra Colt heard it from half a mile up the ridge. He stopped his horse on a rise, gray eyes narrowing toward the sound. A man of near 7 feet, weathered by 20 years of wind, war, and wilderness, Ezra looked carved from the land itself, a monument of muscle and stone. But when he heard that scream again, thinner, desperate, something inside him stirred. He kicked his horse hard, and the animal bolted down the rocky slope. The canyon closed around him like a throat, every sound sharp and alive. As Ezra rounded the bend, the wreck came into view. The carriage lay on its side, one wheel still spinning lazily. White linen and lace spilled like snow across the red earth, and among them a body pinned beneath the frame. The man's black coat marked him clearly. A preacher. Ezra leapt from the saddle before his horse stopped. His boots hit the ground with a thud, and then he heard another sound. A whimper, soft and frightened, from inside the broken carriage. He dropped to one knee, his rough hands pushing aside splintered wood. There, caught between the wreckage and the canyon wall, was a girl. Her white dress was torn, her dark hair tangled with dust and blood. She couldn't have been more than 20. Ezra braced his shoulder against the carriage and pushed. Wood groaned, his muscles strained, and sweat rolled down his temple. Inch by inch, the heavy frame lifted just enough for her to crawl free. When she pulled herself clear, he let it drop with a crash that echoed through the canyon. For a long moment, she just knelt in the dirt, staring at him with eyes wide as the sky, blue with a hint of violet in the fading light. Then fear replaced gratitude. She shrank back, trembling. Ezra understood. To her, he was no savior, just a giant stranger rising from the dust, scarred and grim as judgment. He raised both hands, palms open. "I ain't here to hurt you," he said, his voice rough and deep, "but you need to move. That man under there, is he breathing?" Her lips trembled. She looked toward the crushed preacher and nodded weakly. "My father," she whispered, "Preacher Samuel Whitmore, please, please help him." Ezra knelt beside the fallen man. One look told him the truth. The preacher's chest rose shallow, blood darkening his vest. He had minutes left, no more. Ezra pressed a steadying hand to the man's shoulder, but his eyes flicked toward the girl. Her hands shaking, her dress torn, her face streaked with tears. The preacher tried to speak. Blood bubbled instead of words. The girl fell to her knees beside him, sobbing, "Father, please!" Ezra caught her wrist gently before she could touch him. "Don't," he said softly. "Let him go easy." She looked up at him, eyes full of disbelief. "No! You lifted it before. You can do it again. You're strong enough." But Ezra only shook his head. "Moving it'll kill him faster. Let him rest." The girl made a broken sound and tried anyway, clawing at the carriage with trembling fingers. Ezra wrapped his arms around her, pulling her back. She struggled, beating at his chest. But he didn't let go until her fight melted into sobs. She sagged against him, small and trembling, her face buried against his shirt. By the time the sun sank behind the cliffs, the preacher was gone. The desert fell silent again, broken only by Clara Whitmore's quiet weeping. Ezra laid his coat gently over the dead man's face, the act done with reverence that came from long practice. He'd buried too many people in his time, soldiers, friends, strangers. Death was no stranger here. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. "Clara." She said through tears, "Clara Whitmore." He nodded. "Clara, I'm Ezra Colt. I'll bury your father proper. Then we'll get you somewhere safe." She looked around. At the wreckage, at the endless walls of stone. "There's nowhere," she whispered. "We were going to Redemption Springs. Father had a church waiting. We sold everything to make the journey." Her voice broke. "Now there's nothing." Ezra studied her. Dust and tears streaked her pale face, but her chin lifted despite it all. There was courage there, buried deep but real. "You'll come with me," he said at last. "I've got a cabin 2 days north. You can stay till you figure your next step." Clara's eyes widened. "I can't," she stammered. "That wouldn't be proper. I'm an unmarried woman, and you're," she faltered, looking up at his towering frame. "You're a stranger." Ezra's tone stayed steady. "Proper won't keep you alive out here. Cold's coming fast. You got 2 choices. Ride with me or stay and freeze." Reality hit her like a slap. She looked again at her father's still body, the wreckage, the empty desert stretching for miles. Her shoulders squared, voice trembling but firm. "I'll come," she said, "but only after I bury him right." They worked by lamplight. Ezra dug while Clara gathered stones, her hands raw and bleeding by the end. When the grave was ready, he lifted her father's body as gently as if it were a child. Clara knelt by the mound, whispering a prayer through her tears. When she rose, she swayed from exhaustion. Ezra secured what little remained of her belongings, a Bible, 2 dresses, and a small wooden box she wouldn't let out of her sight. "Can you ride?" he asked. Clara nodded, though uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "Not with someone your size," she said softly. Ezra almost smiled. "Horse can handle us both." "Hold on tight." He mounted first and offered his hand. She hesitated only a moment before placing her small palm in his. His grip was warm, steady. He pulled her up behind him in one smooth motion, her dress brushing against his coat. "Hold fast," he said, and the horse surged forward. The canyon wind bit cold as they rode through the darkness. Clara clung to Ezra, her hands gripping the fabric of his shirt. Beneath her palms, she could feel his strength, the solid, immovable steadiness of him. Every jolt of the horse pressed her closer, but he said nothing, only kept them moving through the long night. By dawn, the desert gave way to open grasslands painted gold by the rising sun. Clara's eyes fluttered open. The world looked strange and new, vast and wild. She realized with a start that she felt safe for the first time since the accident. Ezra guided the horse to a small creek. When he helped her down, his hand lingered just long enough to steady her drink. He said, "We've still got a ways to go." Clara knelt by the water, her reflection rippling in the current. A girl who had lost everything and somehow lived. When she looked up, Ezra was watching her, silent and unreadable. Something passed between them then. Not words, not yet, just understanding. Two lost souls in a land that didn't forgive weakness, and neither knew that before the next sunset, their fates would be tied forever. The wind whistled through the pines as night fell over the mountains. Ezra Colt's cabin stood in a small clearing, smoke curling from the chimney, a lonely promise of warmth in the cold wilderness. Clara Whitmore swayed in the saddle, half asleep from exhaustion. When the horse stopped, she blinked awake and gasped softly. The cabin was simple but strong, built by hands that knew survival. Ezra swung down and reached up for her. Clara hesitated just long enough to remember her father's warnings about being alone with strange men. Then she took his hand. He lifted her down as if she weighed nothing. His touch was rough, but careful, the kind of strength that knew its own power. For a moment, her body leaned against his, her head near his chest, and she could hear his steady heartbeat. It felt safe. Too safe. She stepped back quickly, her cheeks burning. Ezra pretended not to notice. "Come on," he said. "You'll catch cold out here." Inside, the cabin was small but neat. One room, a stone fireplace, a wooden table, and a single bed in the corner. Clara's eyes caught on that bed, her throat tightening. Ezra saw the flicker of worry cross her face. "You take the bed," he said, simply. "I'll sleep by the fire." She started to protest. "That's not right. It's your home," he shrugged. "You need rest more than I do." Clara stood there for a long moment, uncertain what to do with such kindness. Finally she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. Ezra busied himself lighting the fire. "There's stew on the shelf. I'll heat it up." As he worked, Clara studied him. He moved with quiet confidence, like a man who'd spent most of his life relying on no one but himself. The firelight threw shadows across his broad shoulders and the old scars that crossed his forearms. She wondered what kind of life left marks like that, and what kind of man could survive it. When the stew was ready, they ate in silence. The only sounds were the crackle of fire and the sigh of wind outside. Clara ate slowly, her hands trembling just enough for him to notice. "You'll be safe here," Ezra said after a while, his voice low but certain. "No one comes this far unless they're lost." Clara looked up, her blue eyes reflecting the firelight. "And you? Are you lost, Mr. Colt?" He smiled faintly, the first she'd seen, maybe once. "Not anymore." She nodded. "Then maybe I'll learn from you." Later, when she lay in his bed wrapped in a rough wool blanket, Clara couldn't sleep. The fire cast soft light across the room. Ezra sat by the hearth, cleaning his rifle. His movements were steady, his expression unreadable. For the first time in days, she wasn't afraid. Not of him, not of the wilderness, not even of what came next. She watched him for a long while, her thoughts tangled between gratitude and curiosity. There was something about him, something that drew her, even though every rule she'd ever been taught warned her to keep her distance. Finally, she closed her eyes, whispering a prayer she wasn't sure anyone still heard. "Thank you," she murmured, not to heaven, but to the man who had carried her from ruin to safety. When morning came, the world was wrapped in mist. Clara woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of an axe splitting wood outside. She found a cup waiting by the fire and stepped out into the cool air. Ezra was already working, each swing of the axe precise, powerful. He looked up when he saw her sleep, and he asked a little. She said softly, "It feels strange, being alive when everything's gone." Ezra rested the axe and leaned on the handle. "You keep moving," he said. "That's how you stay alive. You keep putting one foot in front of the other until the world starts to make sense again." Quote. His words settled in her heart like warmth. She realized he wasn't just talking about her. They spent the day fixing the fence and tending to the small garden out back. Clara insisted on helping, though her hands blistered quickly. Ezra showed her how to dig properly, how to tie a splint for the broken post. His patience surprised her. He wasn't a man of many words, but when he spoke, his voice carried calm certainty, and that made her brave. As the sun dipped behind the trees, they rested on the porch. The forest hummed with life. Cicadas, wind, distant thunder. Clara hugged her knees, watching the sky change color. "Do you ever miss people?" she asked quietly. Ezra's gaze stayed on the horizon. "Sometimes. But people don't last out here. Land's too hard, life's too short." She turned toward him. "Then why stay?" He met her eyes, and for a heartbeat, she thought she saw the truth. The loneliness behind the strength, because this land don't lie. He said, "It gives back only what you put in." "I can live with that." Clara smiled faintly. "My father used to say the same thing about faith." Quote. Ezra looked at her then, really looked, at the dirt smudged on her cheeks, the tired light in her eyes, and the strength she didn't know she had. "Your father raised a brave one," he said. Her throat tightened. "He raised me to be obedient." "I don't think that's the same as brave." "Obedience won't keep you alive out here," Ezra said, "but courage might." The rain started not long after. A hard, sudden mountain storm that drove them both inside. The cabin felt smaller now, the air thick with the smell of rain and pine. Clara mended a torn sleeve while Ezra sat by the fire, oiling his rifle. Thunder rolled, shaking the walls. She jumped. Ezra looked up. "You afraid of storms?" "Not afraid," she said quickly, then smiled faintly. "Maybe, a little." He chuckled low in his chest. "Don't worry. Roof solid. Built it myself." The sound of his laughter eased her tension. It was the first time she'd heard it, and it warmed something deep inside her. The rain lasted hours. They talked quietly, about small things, like the land, the animals, the stars. Ezra spoke of his time on the frontier, the men he'd worked with, the battles he'd survived. Clara listened, drawn to the steady rhythm of his voice. When the storm finally passed, the fire burned low. Ezra stood, stretching his massive frame. "You should sleep," he said. "And you?" she asked. "I'll keep watch," he replied. "Do you always keep watch?" "Always," he said simply. Clara hesitated, then reached out and touched his arm. "You don't have to protect me every moment." Ezra looked down at her hand, small, soft against his scarred skin. "Maybe I'm not just protecting you," he said quietly. Her breath caught. She didn't know what to say, so she withdrew her hand. "Good night, Ezra," she whispered. "Good night, Clara." She lay awake for a long time after that, listening to the fire crackle and the wind sigh through the trees. Something had changed between them that night, something neither of them could name, but both could feel. It wasn't just safety anymore, it was trust. It was the beginning of something that could either save them both or destroy them. The days passed quietly after the storm. The land softened under spring's touch, and the forest began to bloom again. Clara found a rhythm in the cabin, cooking, cleaning, tending the small garden. Ezra hunted, chopped wood, repaired the roof, and sometimes disappeared into the woods for hours, returning with fresh game or pelts to trade. At first, they spoke little. Words felt unnecessary, but as the weeks turned to months, silence gave way to conversation, gentle, steady, and full of moments that felt too heavy to name. Clara learned Ezra's habits, how he drank his coffee black and always left half a cup to cool by the window, how he rose before dawn without a sound, how he watched the sky at night like it held the answers to things he couldn't say aloud. Ezra learned her rhythms too, how she hummed softly when she cooked, how she whispered prayers she didn't truly believe, how she'd stand at the creek and stare at her reflection as if she didn't recognize the woman staring back. Something fragile was growing between them, something they both felt but didn't dare name. It was in the way Ezra's eyes lingered when Clara brushed hair from her face, and the way her heartbeat quickened every time he smiled. Rare, quiet, real. One afternoon, as the sun sank low, Ezra returned from a hunting trip with news. "I'm heading into town," he said. "We're low on salt and lamp oil." Clara's hands stilled on the table. "How long?" Quote, "3 days, maybe 4. She nodded, but the thought of being alone in the cabin made her chest tighten, Ezra noticed. "You'll be safe here," he said. "I'll make sure the rifle's loaded." Clara forced a small smile. "I'm not afraid. I just don't like the quiet." Ezra looked at her for a long moment, then touched the brim of his hat. "I'll be back soon." When he rode out at dawn, Clara watched until he disappeared into the trees. The silence that followed was deeper than she'd expected, the kind that pressed against your heart and made you listen to every creak and breath. The first night passed slowly. The second was worse. The wind howled, and shadows danced on the walls. Clara lit every lamp and read aloud from her father's old Bible, just to fill the air with sound. She fell asleep at the table, the rifle within reach. When Ezra returned on the 3rd day, she ran out to meet him before he'd even dismounted. The relief in her face stopped him cold. "You're all right," he said. "You took too long." She replied, her voice trembling more than she meant it to. Ezra dismounted and set a rough hand on her shoulder. "I told you I'd come back." Clara swallowed hard. "I know. I just didn't realize how much I'd come to believe you." Something in his expression softened. He brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. "You've gotten strong out here," he said. "Stronger than you know." That night, as they shared supper by the fire, the air between them felt different. No more hesitation. No more pretending they were just two strangers bound by circumstance. When their hands brushed, reaching for the same bowl, neither pulled away. Clara looked up, her blue eyes steady Ezra. She said quietly, "Do you ever think about what happens next?" He studied her face, searching for meaning next. "I can't stay here forever," she said. "And yet, I don't know how to go back to the world. Everything there feels smaller now." Ezra set down his fork. Then, "Don't go back," she blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you can stay," he said simply. "This land's big enough for both of us. You've made it your home, whether you meant to or not." Clara's heart pounded. People would talk. "There's no people here," he said. "Just us." She looked at him for a long moment, seeing not just the giant cowboy who'd saved her, but the man who'd given her strength when she had none. "I don't want to be a burden," she whispered. Ezra leaned forward slightly, his voice low. "You're not. You never were." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and in that small cabin, something shifted, not loud or sudden, but deep and certain. Clara reached across the table and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, rough and warm and solid. From that night on, they lived not as strangers, but as partners. Clara worked beside him, planting new crops, mending fences, gathering herbs from the hills. Ezra taught her to shoot, to track, to survive without fear. He stopped calling her Miss Whitmore. She stopped calling him Mr. Colt. They were simply Clara and Ezra. Seasons changed, and the cabin grew fuller, with laughter, with warmth, with life. Sometimes travelers stopped by, lost or hungry. Clara would feed them, and Ezra would fix their wagons or tend their horses. Word spread quietly through the nearby settlements of the preacher's daughter who had vanished into the wilderness, and the giant cowboy who'd built her a home. Years later, when their first child was born, Clara held the baby close and whispered, "You'll never have to live by anyone else's rules. Not mine, not his." Just your own Ezra, standing beside her, smiled faintly. "She's got your courage," he said. "And your stubbornness," Clara replied. The child's tiny fingers curled around his rough thumb, and for the first time in his life, Ezra Colt felt the weight of peace. They built a life that defied everything the world expected. Not perfect, not easy, but theirs. And in the quiet evenings when the sun slipped behind the pines, Clara would sit beside Ezra on the porch, watching the light fade from the sky. "Do you ever think about the day we met?" she'd ask. "Every time I hear thunder," he'd say, "reminds me of the wheel breaking and how close I came to riding past that canyon." "And if you had?" she'd ask softly. He'd turn to her, his gray eyes full of warmth. "Then I'd still be lost." She'd smile, resting her head against his arm. "So would I." The world around them changed. Towns grew, roads stretched farther, and the wilderness shrank, but their little cabin stayed the same. A small miracle, built from chance, courage, and love, that had nothing to do with propriety, and everything to do with choosing each other, every single day. And sometimes, when the night was clear and the fire low, Clara would whisper to the stars, "Thank you for breaking that wheel." Because in the heart of the Wild West, where survival was hard and kindness rare, a giant cowboy and a preacher's daughter had found something worth living for. A home, a family, and a love strong enough to last through any storm.